The life of a 21-year-old is more important than the life of an 81-year-old. Those who don't understand that are either ignorant or part of a weird marginal cult, such as Branch Covidianism, though that is by no means the only group that fails to understand basic realities. Finally, we're back to the general majority understanding this, even though it took a bit longer than expected. You shouldn't be mutilating or sterilizing children. The good news is that finally more and more authorities understand this. The bad news is that it took a while for that to sink in as well. And finally, education is about the ability to be wrong in the process. We shouldn't need a law to explicitly stipulate that, but such is the nature of the current year. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the 12th edition of the Good News video. Man, it's been almost 3 years since the previous episode, so for those who joined the Freedom Alternative in the meantime, this series, as the name says, is a short overview through the news of the previous weeks that we consider politically good. The more outrageous for the collectivists, the better. So, university free speech to be protected after government U-turn via the Telegraph. Free speech powers to protect controversial speakers from being cancelled by universities are set to become law after a government U-turn. Plans to water down the law that will enable academics and students to sue institutions for breaching their free speech rights have been dropped, the Telegraph can disclose. Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, had signed off on amendments that would mean academics and students could only seek compensation in the courts as a last resort after first pursuing complaints through the procedures of the relevant university and the higher education regulator. However, those amendments to the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill have now been dropped following a backlash from Tory MPs, cancelled academics and free speech campaigners who said they would make the laws toothless. Professor Jo Phoenix, a professor of criminology who quit the Open University after she said it failed to protect her right to free speech in the face of attacks by transgender activists, said ministers were right to scrap the horrendous amendments, which sets out the new powers for academics to sue universities for free speech breaches via a statutory tort. Without this clause, the pathway for an individual to seek redress was going to be so convoluted as to be practically impossible, she said. Retaining the tort element sends a message to universities that they do need to take some responsibilities for the actions of their staff and students, because there is now a more direct route to financial compensation. The U-turn places Tory MPs on a collision course with the party's peers who voted in December to scrap the law that would allow universities to be sued for free speech breaches entirely. Lord Willits, a former Conservative Universities minister, argued that the law new powers for academics and students would be overly burdensome for universities and were unnecessary for protecting free speech. Honk. However, Claire Coutinho, an education minister who is seen as a rising star in the Conservative Party, a protege of Rishi Sunak and an ally of Trade Secretary Kemi Badenoch, has successfully argued that the tort should be reinstated to protect free speech on campuses. On Thursday night, Ms. Coutinho said, "I stand firm in my belief that the tort is an essential part of the bill and that academics, students and speakers must be able to go to court when their rights to free speech have been wrongly infringed. It is understood that Tory MPs will be whipped to reject the Lord's amendment to scrap the tort." Unquote. Good! Now, it is indeed deeply unfortunate that such a law is indeed needed in the first place. I mean, for hundreds of years, it was understood as a default that at the very least in universities, one should be able to discuss anything, including and especially the most controversial topics. And this understanding held for so long because it relied on another understanding, namely that the audience is certainly smart enough to deal with the topics. But unfortunately, both understandings have gotten weaker, not just because of the academic left, but also because of a larger trend which predates the academic left. Now, that doesn't mean the left is without fault, mind you. The left very likely accelerated and made things far worse. But leftism notwithstanding, the issue predates their very existence. The issue I'm talking about is a long 100 plus years trend of abandoning wisdom, embracing extremism, and more recently abandoning learning itself too. Wisdom has left the halls of universities almost 100 years ago, and this is true everywhere, not just in Britain, though it is probably more visible in Britain. Intellectuals in general, and British intellectuals in particular, used to speak at least 4 languages fluently and another 4 or 5 semi-fluently. They used to be able to describe several sets of competing ideas in great detail and used to be able to deliver nuanced opinions about things and were always precise in their language. Even if you disagreed heavily with them, at least you would learn something new. And this was just 70 or 80 years ago. How many British intellectuals fit into that category today? I mean, look, I found this article from The Guardian purporting to list the top 300 contemporary British intellectuals. Okay, the article is from 2011, but still. And I looked up about 140 out of them and found only 2 of them spoke more than 2 languages fluently, none of them more than 4, and only 1 is able to describe competing ideas, and only a handful are able to be precise in their language. A lot more of them spoke 2 languages simply because they're of an immigrant background, which tells me all I need to know on why the intellectual class is so adamant on mass immigration. Well, of course they are, since so many of them are immigrants. But this also tells me something else. The indigenous population is no longer able to produce quality intellectuals. Or maybe it does, but it's not recognized. And this isn't an indictment of British intellectuals per se, but more like an indictment of public Western intellectuals in general, since this is a very common phenomenon, albeit far worse in the English-speaking world. So-called recognized intellectuals are simply not worthy of being called as such. The list presented by The Guardian 12 years ago is one full of very credentialed and awarded people, all right, but far from relevant, most of them. So take for instance this law that we regard as great news. It was pushed by people like Konstantin Kisin, who is a Russian Jew, Claire Coutinho, who is a descendant of Portuguese-influenced Indian Catholics, and Arif Muhyiddin Ahmed, a philosopher of Middle Eastern origin. None of these people are particularly credentialed, so this tells me not only that the credentialing system is thoroughly out of touch, but it is indeed an active hindrance. And none of this will be solved anytime soon, likely not during our lifetimes. However, having much more explicit free speech protections in universities is without question a very good step in the correct direction. So there's that, I guess. Speaking of steps in the right direction, the New York Times, a former newspaper, the College Board strips down its AP curriculum for African American Studies. The official course looks different from a previous draft. No more critical race theory. The study of contemporary topics like Black Lives Matter is now optional. After heavy criticism from Governor Ron DeSantis, the College Board released on Wednesday an official curriculum for its new advanced placement course in African American Studies, stripped of much of the subject matter that had angered the governor and other conservatives. The College Board purged the name of many black writers and scholars associated with critical race theory, the queer experience, and black feminism. It ushered out some politically fraught topics like Black Lives Matter from the formal curriculum. And it added something new. Black conservatism is now offered as an idea for a research project. When it announced its AP course in August, the College Board clearly believed it was providing a class whose time has come, and it was celebrated by eminent scholars like Who Gives a Shit of Harvard as an affirmation of the importance of African American studies. But the course quickly ran into a political buzz, saw first from conservatives after an early draft leaked to conservative publications like the Florida Standard and National Review. And then once the curriculum was released on Wednesday, some academics and liberal groups protested the change. changes. The dispute over the AP course is about more than just the content of a high school class. Education is the center of much vitriolic partisan debate, and the College Board's decision to try to build a curriculum covering one of the most charged topics in the country, the history of race in America, may have all but guaranteed controversy. If anything, the arguments over the curriculum underscore the fact that the United States is a country that cannot agree on its own story, especially the complex history of Black Americans, close quote. Now hold on a second. See, this is why places like the New York Times must be presumed to be hyper-partisan extremist peddlers of disinformation outright. This isn't a vitriolic partisan debate at all. Is Black Lives Matter a Marxist-Leninist terrorist group? Of course it is. They admit it themselves. There is no controversy there. There is no hyper-partisan vitriolic debate. Now, should the stories of Marxist-Leninist terrorist groups be part of the curricula for high schools? Of course not. Are you out of your freaking mind? Now, what's next? A fair hearing from ISIS? Maybe the PKK? Why not the story of the Aryan Brotherhood? I mean, if we're getting violent collectivists into the curricula, let's be fair to all of them, right? Of course that would be ridiculous, and everyone knows it. But instead of reporting that, the New York Times frames this as if it is a controversy, but it's really not. Heck, longtime adversaries of Ron DeSantis from the education establishment ended up standing for the assessment that this whole thing is trash. Why? Because it was trash, that's why. And there was no controversy about that fact, and framing it any other way is simply dishonest. But then again, the New York Times is always dishonest, so there's that. Quote, the attack on the AP course turned out to be the prelude to a much larger agenda. Ooh. On Tuesday, Mr. DeSantis unveiled a proposal to overhaul higher education that would eliminate what he called ideological conformity by, among other things, mandated courses in Western civilization. In another red flag to the College Board, there was the possibility of another opposition. More than 24 states have adopted some sort of measure against critical race theory, according to a tracking project by the University of California, Los Angeles Law School. David Coleman, the head of the College Board, said in an interview that the changes were all made for pedagogical reasons, of course they were, not to bow to political pressure. At the College Board, we can't look to statements of political leaders. The changes came from the input of professors and long-standing AP principals, sort of. In light of the conservative criticism, the College Board seemed to opt out of the politics. The revised 234-page curriculum framework ranges widely through content on Africa, slavery, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement, and there's content on redlining, discrimination and Afrofuturism, as well as stories of individual achievement and heroism. But the study of contemporary topics, including Black Lives Matter, incarceration, queer life, and the debate over reparations, is downgraded. The subjects are no longer part of the exam and are simply offered on a list of options for a required research project. And even that list, in a nod to local laws, quote, can be refined by local states and districts, unquote. The expunged writers and scholars include Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor of Columbia, which touts her work as foundational in critical race theory. Wait a minute, I thought that's not happening. It also includes Roderick Ferguson, a Yale professor who has written about queer social movements, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author who has made the case for reparations for slavery. Gone too is Bell Hooks, the writer who shaped discussions about race, feminism, and class. I love it that Bell Hooks is not even capitalized. Anyway, after the curriculum was released, Professor Crenshaw said that even if her name and others had been taken out of the curriculum because secondary sources, theorists or analysts were being eliminated in favor of facts and lived experience, the decision sent a troubling message. I would have made a different choice, she said. Even the appearance of bowing to political pressure in the context of new knowledge and ideas is something that should not be done. But she said she was also disappointed because she had believed the course would capitalize on a hunger of young students to learn ways of thinking about things like police brutality, mass incarceration, and continuing inequalities. Now, hold on a second. I mean, seriously. A hunger of young students to learn about continuing inequalities? No, with the risk of sounding like a soy boy from the internet, but I will ask, source? This is an extraordinary claim that should require extraordinary evidence, quite frankly. I mean, young people of today aren't fundamentally different from the young people of the 1990s and 1950s or the 1890s or the 1590s. Biology and statistical norms really haven't changed that much. To claim that there is a, quote, hunger of young students to learn, insert ideological talking point here, is so extraordinary that the best course of action when encountering such a talking point is to presume it's bullshit. There is a tendency of the young to be revolutionary inclined, yes. Such tendency has been observed in the young for over 3,000 years. But there is no reason to believe that that tendency is exclusively a left-wing one. Because it isn't. What young people end up being interested in is partly accident and randomness, but also partly a policy choice. So what this left-winger or far-left professor, maybe I should say, at Columbia actually means is that she's upset that finally someone somewhere made the policy choice of no longer pushing her narrow, extremist, illiberal, violent point of view. Now, being upset about that is of course fine, but it's also great news for everyone else. You know, everyone else that would be the capital M majority that is simply sick and tired of this disdainful nonsense. Quote, David Blight, a professor of American history at Yale University, said Wednesday that he had written an endorsement of the new curriculum at the College Board's request, and that he believed it had much more to offer, not just about history, but also about black poetry, art, and the origins of the blues, jazz, and hip-hop. But he withdrew his endorsement on Wednesday after learning that some sections had been cut. I withdrew it because I want to know when and how they made these decisions to excise these people, because that's also an attack on their academic freedom. PEN America, a free speech organization, echoed that concern. While the College Board had said the changes were not political, the board risked sending the message that political threats against the teaching of particular types of content can succeed in silencing that content, says Jeremy Young, senior manager of free speech and education at PEN America. The changes were also condemned by the National Parents Union and the CFT, a California affiliate of the American Federation of Teachers, representing education workers from childhood through higher education. This is good. No, this is really good. So notice the multiple layers of dishonesty here. The National Parents Union is an NGO that was founded in 2020 as an AstroTurf organization to annoy the unions. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of undermining the teachers' unions, but let's not pretend that the National Parents Union is national or about parents. Like, there is no evidence that there is any parent in that organization to begin with. As for the CFT, who cares what they think? Is the point of view of that California affiliate mainstream for American parents? Probably not. And is it representative of the point of view of parents in Florida? Absolutely not. If that had been the case, then Ron DeSantis wouldn't have won in a landslide in 2022 and promising to go hard against the left in education. Anyway, quote, Dr. Gates, who was a consultant of the curriculum, said he was sorry that the College Board's policy is not to require secondary sources in its curricula. He teaches Harvard's Introduction to American Studies and academic subjects such as intersectionality and critical race theory. Again, I thought that doesn't exist. The 1619 Project, reparations for slavery, black homophobia, and anti-Semitism are fair game, of course, for such a class, he said in an email. And the New York Times, of course, reminds everyone that the 1619 Project is their initiative and is full of shit. Okay, this is really good. The left should really keep it up with these ridiculous demands. As the public is getting increasingly woke on the leftist question, doubling down on this BS is, of course, a great guarantee for a glorious backlash. Listen, nobody cares about the 1619 Project, and most definitely nobody wants to pay ridiculous property taxes so that some wankers off of college stuff their kids' heads with such important topics such as the origins of hip-hop or black homophobia. Nobody cares. The fact that so many of these so-called intellectuals refuse to consider this is great news in itself. Because, quite frankly, trying to reach a compromise with these loons is morally reprehensible at this point. No, the entire framework must be rejected wholesale. Think of the children. Like, seriously. Also, more and more non-leftists have to start learning how to wield power. I don't know how to say this more clearly. Yes, I know you want to be left alone. Believe me, so do I. But that's not how reality works with people who have no intention of leaving you alone. You may not be interested in politics, but politics will always be interested in you. Your family, they'll also be interested in your money, and of course they'll always be interested in your liberty. So if you want to be left alone, you have to be able to and also willing to wield power against those who will not leave you alone. And this is what annoys me with certain groups, particularly Western conservatives. They're so willing to wield power, or maybe I should say they're so unwilling to wield power, even after they amass quite a lot of it. This is also why I like Ron DeSantis, quite frankly. He doesn't go far enough, I would say, but at least he's trying. If it were up to me, I'd go further and simply disallow AP curricula altogether in state schools and intentionally hire superintendents and other authority figures who would purposefully work hard to dissuade as many students as possible from taking the AP exam. At the end of the day, AP is a business, and its main purpose is to get more revenue, an aspect which is acknowledged even by this dishonest New York Times piece, although in the second to last paragraph where they say, quote, acceptance for the new curriculum is important to the College Board, which is a non-profit, because AP courses are a major source of revenue. The board took in more than $1 billion in program service revenue in 2019, of which more than $490 million came from AP and instruction according to its tax-exempt filing. Yes, thank you. That piece of information should have been in the first paragraph. But then again, that's why I like DeSantis. He's willing to at least try to go to the jugular by actively threatening the sources of revenue of left-wing institutions rather than waste time on debate. The time for debate is long over anyway, and the College Board, just like the diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, aren't in it for a good faith argument. They're all in it for the grift. So taking away the source of grift is a very legitimate and effective way of weakening their power. All right. Next good news, also via the Pravda on Hudson. I always love to read the good news from the enemy's propaganda outlet. Utah bans transition care for transgender youth. The measure, signed by the governor on Saturday, is part of a wave of proposed legislation in states across the country this year that would restrict transgender rights. Governor Spencer Cox of Utah signed a bill on Saturday that blocks minors from receiving gender transition health care. The first such measure in the country this year, in what is expected to be a wave of legislation by state lawmakers to restrict transgender rights. The law prohibits transgender youth in the state from receiving gender-affirming surgery and places an indefinite ban on hormone therapy with limited exceptions. Good! Leading medical groups, including the American Medical Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and the American Academy of Pediatrics, have rejected claims that gender-affirming care is harmful to transgender children or adults. And this, my fellow plebs, is why I'm so adamant about the fact that the medical profession in general, not just public health, is, put simply, wholly illegitimate. If the, quote, leading medical groups, unquote, can't agree that sterilizing and mutilating children while messing with their brains by enabling a mental disorder, if they can't agree this is harmful, then the so-called leading medical groups are illegitimate. That's it. There's no way around it. And everything they say should be presumed a lie until proven otherwise. In fact, I would say even if proven otherwise. Probatio diabolica on these asshats. Utah joined 4 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, and Tennessee, that have enacted laws restricting transgender youth's access to gender transition care. Federal judges in Arkansas and Alabama have temporarily blocked enforcement of these measures pending the outcome of lawsuits. Lawmakers in Oklahoma and South Carolina have proposed criminalizing all gender-affirming health care for transgender people under 26-year-olds. Bills in Kansas and Mississippi would ban such care up to age 21. Well, that part is wrong. Man, look, I love my American friends, but you all need to learn moderation, for crying out loud. Not everything that is immoral needs to be illegal, no matter what you define as immoral. Is the so-called gender transition care harmful? Yes, of course it is. And yes, it's harmful for all. Should it be banned for 25-year-olds? No, of course not. I mean, what's wrong with y'all? I could understand not to be covered by state insurance. In fact, I think it should not be covered by taxpayers at all in any circumstance, ever, on any age. But to criminalize it for people under 26, no, that's too far. Besides, if teenagers find a way to fake their ID to get into a disco, then it stands to reason that determined 25-year-old adults will find a way to harm themselves and stuff the pockets of Big Pharma if they so please. And that's the thing. These issues should also be treated on the grift front too. Most of the push for this comes as a result of the grift opportunity. So the non-left should actively attack their funding too. There's only so much the criminal law can do. Yes, by all means, make it a felony to do this to children, but if you want to lower the phenomenon overall, do it the American way. Bankrupt them. The cost of compliance for a so-called gender clinic should start from $10 million per day. Let's see who wants to open one. See, we're not criminalizing you, we're just considerate of the wider societal interests here and due compensations to society for the harms incurred as a result of the existence of your clinic. Even better, make these funds go to explicitly anti-trans groups that help detransitioners, desisters, and other victims of this horror freak show, plus legal groups whose sole job is to litigate against this in every court that would hear them. The whole show would be over before 2030. But you see, that would mean conservatives actually wielding power and actually aiming to win. I'm gonna have to wait a lot for that. Anyway, sticking around the trans topic, Montana bill would let students misgender classmates via the Seattle Times. So this bill would essentially protect freedom of expression, since there is no such thing as the right not to be misgendered, right? Montana schools would not be able to punish students who purposely misgender or dead name their transgender peers under a Republican-backed legislative proposal that opponents argue will increase bullying of children who are already struggling for acceptance. The proposal, co-sponsored by more than 24 GOP lawmakers, would declare that it's not discrimination to use a transgender classmate's legal name or refer to them by their birth gender. Schools would be prevented from adopting policies to punish students who do so. Good! Now, this is what I call wielding power. Now, of course, some would say that this isn't a big issue, but it absolutely is. The absolute right to always speak the truth is the most important thing. I don't remember who said it, someone smarter than me for sure, but the most important thing is the ability to speak the truth loudly. Everything else follows. Consequently, forbidding anyone from being able to punish others for telling the truth is equally important. Nobody anywhere should ever face any punishment for telling the truth. Oh, but this would increase the bullying, cried the opponents of this bill. No, it won't. Besides, if you think children won't bully each other because some boomers in the State House said something, you must be very old or have forgotten your childhood. Children can be, and routinely are, very cruel to each other anyway. And sometimes that requires adult intervention, yes, but not when the children are telling the truth. That should never require intervention unless it is to praise the child. There is no such thing as transgender children, and claiming otherwise is cruelty by adults inflicted upon children. And quite frankly, the hard drives of those adults should be checked. Starting with the grooming organizations that send their minions to testify against these bills. Yes, what I'm proposing is nasty, but that's what wielding power means. If you want your children to be left alone, you have to go after those whose full-time job is not to leave your children alone. And much more progress on these issues would be achieved when more segments of the non-left understand this. But until then, I guess it's good enough to at least have laws that fiercely protect the freedom to tell the truth. It's certainly a step in the right direction. All right. And finally, one more good news on a topic I've been wanting to say something for a few months already. The New York Times, for older Americans, the pandemic is not over. Seniors are increasingly left to protect themselves as the rest of the country abandons precautions. Americans do not agree about the duty to protect others. No, I'm definitely not reading all of this Branch Covidianism manifesto, but it has two paragraphs buried into it that deliver the good news. Quote, Nancy Berlinger, a bioethicist and research scholar at the Hastings Center, made a similar point. The foundational questions about ethics are about what we owe others, not just ourselves, not just our circle of family and friends. 3 years in, the societal answer seems clear. With masks and vaccination mandates mostly ended, testing centers and vaccination clinics closed, and the federal public health emergency scheduled to expire in May, older adults are on their own. Good! Now, to some of you, this may seem cruel, and to be perfectly honest with you, I simply don't give a shit. The fact of the matter is that the quality of life of 21-year-olds is and has always been far more important than the quality of life of 81-year-olds. And I hope that when my generation reaches that age, if it ever does, we will be far less insufferable than these people. The article from the New York Times is a screeching by Branch Covidians and an indictment of individualism and liberty itself, but quite frankly, Branch Covidianism itself is immoral even from a collectivist utilitarian standpoint. Never in history have the collective lives and whims of 80-plus-year-olds been prioritized over children, who are, after all, the future of the nation. Never. This never happened before, until this utterly disgusting cult of Branch Covidianism emerged. And when I say Branch Covidianism, I refer to everything, yes, absolutely everything done in the name of the so-called pandemic. From keeping children out in the cold, filling skate parks with sand to prevent teenagers from congregating, to shutting down schools, to mask mandates, to QR codes, everything. 100% of all of that was not just immoral, illiberal, illegal, and insane, but utterly useless even on its own terms as well. The article harps on the usual tropes. Oh, but in Asia they've always been wearing masks. First of all, that's not true, and never has been true. But, I've just spent quite some time in Asia just a few months ago. Nobody's doing that. Come on. Oh, but you see, Kyrgyzstan is the wrong kind of Asia. No, seriously, that's one of the answers I was given. Fine, okay, at the end of this year, I'll go to Laos and Cambodia. I'll see there how much masking there is. But still, there's two problems with such an argument. Oh, but they do that in Asia. Well, even if that were true, so what? We are not Asians, and we're not in Asia. And masking from time to time is and has always been a marginal habit, even in Japan or South Korea. But even if it had been a routine thing, so what? Why should a disgusting and weird habit of a totally alien civilization from ours should constitute an argument for anything? Yeah, a few places in Asia sometimes mask, so what? A few places in Africa sometimes burn witches at stake. Do we adopt that too? And two, if we're in this business of adopting Japanese habits, why not adopt the Japanese habit of praising the old people who sacrifice themselves so as to avoid young people being sacrificed? During the Fukushima nuclear disaster, more than 200 Japanese pensioners have volunteered to clean up the nuclear waste, insisting that they should be facing the dangers of radiation and not the young. And some of them were retired nuclear engineers, so high-skilled people too, who knew the dangers all too well. How about that? Why shouldn't we adopt this Japanese habit? They could do it with radiation, which is a guarantee to kill. Why can't we do it for a cold? Why should healthy young people, and especially children, suffer indefinitely so that 81-year-olds live for a few more months? The number 81 is not randomly chosen. The absolute majority of the people dying allegedly from COVID in the United States as of February 2023 is 81. This stands true for most of the world, by the way. And the good news here is that the vast majority of society finally, hallelujah, reached the same conclusion, although of course few would dare to put it in such blunt words as I just did. The other good news is that even the readers of the New York Times have slowly reached to this conclusion. I mean, check the comment section. It's chock full of old people who make more or less the same argument that as I'm making. Of course, it's also full of frightened boomers and weird leftists, but the fact that the sofa argument makes its way into the NYT picks category, which is the category of comments that the editorial board deems relevant, is a testament that the debate is over. The bad news, of course, is that it took so long to reach this otherwise obvious conclusion. I had expected this to be sorted in 15 to 18 months. The fact that it took almost 36 months is yet another testament of just how weak the public intellectuals have gotten. And no, I'm sorry, this can't be excused away because there was online censorship. Online censorship prolonged the ordeal, yes, but maybe by a month, maybe by 2 months. The rest of the excess is due to cowardice. And owning up to that fact going forward is crucial so as to avoid making the same mistakes in the future. And there's another good news buried in here. The fact that the unequivocal repudiation of Branch Covidianism won. Many of those who are in the Covido-skeptic camp would have been content with half-assed wins. A mask mandate here, a QR code there, a new normal. It is a very positive news that that position also lost, and that the radical notion that the world is neither a septic laboratory nor a hospital won. Yes, liberty is messy and comes with trade-offs, but its trade-offs and messiness are far better than sanitary fascism under the guise of compassion and safety. And I will maintain this position even if this fluffy cough had been airborne Ebola. And the good news is that this argument always wins out. The struggle is to shorten the period until it wins out. With all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your continuous and generous financial support. Don't forget to subscribe, visit our website, and I'll see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.